Welcome everyone to this session on how do people decide what they want to know. I'm Sam Haynes from the Behavioral Insights team, and we'll be hearing from Professor Tali Sharot from University College London and Professor Cass Sunstein, Harvard Law School. Let's give them both a warm welcome. As we only have 45 minutes for this session, we're going to go straight to the first presentation from Professor Sharot. When she concludes, Cass will come to the podium and deliver his presentation, and then we'll have about 15 minutes for questions. For this session, we will not be using Slido, so if you have a question, write it down, and we'll have a roving mic to come to you after the presentations are finished. Tali, please.
Okay, thank you. So we're going to talk about how people decide which information to allow to enter their mind and form their beliefs. Now, we all spend a substantial amount of time seeking and consuming information. And when I talk about information seeking, I don't only mean searching the web or using your apps, but also things like asking your partner and kid what they had planned for the day, calling the doctor to get a result of a blood test, reading a scientific article, sitting here at a talk. But the question is, how do we decide at each point in time what it is that we want to know? So it turns out that this is a particularly difficult problem because knowledge and its avoidance can serve several, sometimes competing functions. So to demonstrate what I mean, we're going to play a little game, and the game is called Do You Want to Know? So if I had information now to give you on whether you had a predisposition to specific forms of cancer, who here would want to know? Put your hand up. Okay, and who here would not want to know? Hands up. Okay, great. So when 400 individuals were posed this question online, just under half said no, kind of similar to what we see here, and just over half said yes. The next question, do you want to know whether your colleagues view you as incompetent? Who here wants to know? Put your hands up. And who here would rather not know? Nice. Okay, next question. Do you want to know whether your colleagues view you as competent? Put your hands up if you want to know. And if you don't want to know, put your hands up. So we posed this question to 100 individuals online with about half an hour in between in which they answered some other questions. And we found that just under half said they did not want to know whether their colleagues saw them as incompetent, but 80% said they did want to know whether their colleagues saw them as competent. So just framing the question in a positive or negative manner by adding IN there really changes what people want to know. And we thought, make sure that this is real. We replicated it in another sample, again, 100 individuals, and we saw the same thing. Okay, last question of our game. Do you want to know whether dogs are related to wolves? Who here wants to know? Put your hands up. Who here cannot care less? Okay. So we posed this question to 2 individuals, Cass and myself. 50% of us, that's Cass, really wanted to know, and 50% of us, that's me, couldn't care less. Okay, so how do we decide what we want to know? So Cass and I wrote a paper about this recently, where we present a framework for understanding the motives that cause people to decide whether they want to know or whether they would rather avoid information. And the framework rests on this idea that information can alter your actions, that is your decisions, your affect, that is your feelings, and your cognition, that is your thoughts. And that people assess these influences and then integrate them into a decision. So for the rest of the talk, I'm going to kind of go into more detail about these ideas and this framework, and then I'm going to show you some experimental data that is related. So let's start with action. So traditional theories of information seeking suggest that people want information that can help them make better decisions, decisions that will help us gain reward and avoid harm. So for example, knowing whether you have the BRCA gene that enhances the likelihood of breast cancer has positive instrumental utility because it can inform decisions on whether to have preventative surgery. Information can sometimes have negative instrumental utility. By that I mean that knowing can actually cause you to make decisions that will make the outcomes worse. And ignorance can actually be the optimal solution. So for example, consider that not knowing the gender of an applicant can actually help you make better hiring decisions because it will help you avoid bias. So information can influence our action in both positive and negative ways. But we also want information sometimes that has no effect on our action, that seems to be not useful, such as whether dogs are related to wolves. And we also sometimes actively avoid information that in fact can be very useful, such as avoiding medical screenings or not wanting to know whether we have a predisposition to cancer. So to understand that kind of decision, we need to consider how information influences our affect, that is, our feelings. Knowing that you have a predisposition to cancer can cause fear, and that is a state that we want to avoid. So we hypothesize that people estimate, consciously or subconsciously, how they would feel if they had a piece of information, and how they would feel if they would forever be ignorant. And they compare these two. And if the anticipated feeling of knowing is better than the anticipated feeling of not knowing, that will enhance their likelihood that they will seek information. However, if they anticipate that not knowing will be better feeling than knowing, they may decide to avoid information, or at least enhance the likelihood that they would avoid information. And finally, information also affects our cognition, that is, our thoughts. And information can both enhance or reduce our ability to comprehend the world around us. And specifically, it can alter what we call our mental models of the world. So mental models are representations of concepts in the world and the relationship between them, such as self, mother, cancer, hospital. Some of these concepts are more central in the sense that we think about them more often, and they are connected to a greater number of other concepts. Now, these central concepts certain concepts can be central in some people's mental models, but not others. So in Cass's mental models, dogs are more central than in my own. And we hypothesize that people are more likely to want information about these central concepts or concepts that are linked to those central concepts. On the other hand, though, if we anticipate that information will break links in these models, such as disconfirming information, we may decide not to seek that information because we anticipate it will cause confusion and a need to rebuild the model. Okay, so our suggestion is that information can affect in both positive and negative ways your action, your affect, and your cognition, and that people estimate these influences and then integrate them into a calculation of the value of information that then can lead to information seeking if the value is significantly positive, its active avoidance if information is significantly negative, or indifference if the value is around 0. So my PhD student, Chris Kelly, and I studied this. We did an experiment to test some of these hypotheses. What we did is we asked people whether they wanted to know 80 different pieces of information about themselves. Do you want to know whether people see you as competent, lazy, shy, sophisticated? Do you want to know whether you have a gene that predisposes you to cancer, to good skin, to Alzheimer's? And then we also, after they made those decisions, we asked them to rate all these pieces of information on A, how useful will it be to know? That gave us an opportunity to assess the instrumental utility of information. How would you feel if you know? How would you feel if you don't know? The difference between the two was a proxy for their hedonic utility. How often do you think about this? This gave us a proxy for cognitive utility. And then we put all this data in this very simple model, and we found that indeed all 3 factors were significant in influencing people's information-seeking decisions. But interestingly, context mattered. So for information that was coming from other individuals, such as how do other people view me, affective cognition had more of an impact than some of other types of information. So let's look a little bit closely at this data. So what I'm going to be plotting here on the y-axis is a percentage of subjects that said they did not want to know each one of these traits. So how people view them as competent, lazy, shy, generous. And I'm going to plot in red those negative traits and in blue, the positive traits. And I'm going to order this from the traits that most people said they didn't want to know to those traits that most people said they did want to know. Okay? So larger numbers means people don't want to know. And what you can see is a very clear trend where people are much less likely to want to know whether others see them as shy, ignorant, incompetent, and much more likely they would want to know whether people see them as kind, honest, helpful, polite, and so on and so forth. So whether you want to know what others think of you depends. It depends on whether it's a question of whether they see you as great or not so great. But another interesting thing here is that you can see that most individuals actually did want to know. So the numbers here are always below 50%. So most people want to know, even if the traits are negative. And this is because, as I said before, the motives for knowing are multiple. It's not only affect or expected effect on our feelings. My other PhD student, Caroline Trumpeter, looked inside people's brains, looked at brain activity while people were making information-seeking decisions. And she indeed found multiple valuation signals. So this region here in the frontal cortex, called the orbital frontal cortex, signaled the value of information independent of affect. So this region didn't care on whether the information is likely to be good or bad, will make us feel good or bad. This other region, deep in the brain, called the midbrain, which is rich in dopamine, this region signaled the value of information in an affect-dependent manner. So it did care whether the information is likely to be good or bad. These two regions project to this other region in the middle called the nucleus cumbus. And here we found that the signal was related to people's choice. And we speculate that this region may be integrating these information values into a choice. Now, the region in the middle of the midbrain here is the same region that responds to food, to sex, to money. So we thought, well, if the brain is treating information that is likely to make you feel good as it treats money, would people willing to pay us to get information that has no use whatsoever, but is likely to make them feel good? And would people be willing to pay us to avoid information that is likely to make them feel bad? So we did another study to test this. And in this study, we had subjects come into the lab, and we gave them an endowment. And they could use the endowment to buy stocks in a stock market that we created in our lab. And then on each trial, we showed them what was going on in our market. So sometimes the market would go up. Sometimes it would go down. And on each trial, we said, hey, do you want to know how much you're worth at this point? The information is not useful. You're not allowed to buy stocks. You're not allowed to sell them. But if you want to know, you could know. But there's a little trick here. If you want to know, you're going to have to pay us. And if you don't want to know, you're also going to have to pay us. And the more you pay us, the more likely we are to honor your request. If you say, I'm not paying you, then it's random. 50% that I'll show you the information, 50% that I won't. So let's say you really want to know, and you say, OK, I'll pay you ADP to know. And so most likely, I will show you how much you're worth at that point. Or you might say, I really don't want to know, and I'll pay you 90p to not know. And then most likely, I won't show you how much you're worth at that point. So first of all, did people pay us? Yes, in about just under half of the trials, they paid us. And out of those trials that they paid us, 2/3 of the time they paid us for knowledge, and 1/3 of the time they paid us for ignorance. So first of all, people want to know even when information is not useful, and they're willing to pay for that knowledge. But what's interesting is what determines whether people want to know or to remain ignorant. So what we found is that what mattered quite a bit was whether the market was going up or going down. So people were more likely to pay us for knowledge when the market was going up than going down. And they were more likely to pay us for ignorance when the market was going down than when it was going up. So when they expected good news, they were more likely to pay for knowledge, and when they expected bad news, they were more likely to pay for ignorance. Or in other words, the worse, and this is something that we found in this study and another study, the worse the expected outcome, the more people want to remain ignorant and they're willing to pay for it. And the better the expected outcome, the more people want to know and they're willing to pay for it. And it turns out that it's not only humans that do this. In a series of studies by our collaborator, Ethan Borbeck-Martin, Ethan showed that monkeys too want to know, even if the knowledge is not going to help them in any way. They wanted to know a few seconds in advance whether they're about to get a large water reward or a small water reward. And they were willing to pay for it. So they would pay a little bit of the water in order to know whether it's going to be something good, large water reward, or not so good, a small water reward. And the more money at stake, the more water at stake, the more they wanted to know. So just to summarize, whether you want to know is related to how you assess information is going to change your actions, your affect, and your cognition. And these decisions matter to things like, should I get medical screenings? Should I read my evaluation? Should I read the reviews on my book? Should I get DNA testing to know about my ancestors? And should I ask what's inside that chocolate cake? And on this and policy implications, we're going to turn over to Cass, and just to thank the students who did the work, which is Chris Kelly and Caroline Trumpeter, and our collaborators, Ethan Borbeck-Martin and Cass Sunstein.
So the relationship between dogs and wolves has the following feature. Are you getting really scared? Dogs show a greatly diminished reactive aggression. That's the major difference. The difference between bonobos and chimpanzees is exactly the same, such that bonobos are the dogs of apes. The relationship between Homo sapiens and the several extinct Homo predecessors, including Homo erectus and Neanderthal man, and the Denovians, is exactly the same, a reduction in reactive aggression. Human beings are the dogs of the Homo species. Are you starting to get more interested in this question? Okay, so the motivation for this project grows out of work on behaviorally informed interventions, and in particular, informational interventions of the sort that in India, in the United Kingdom, in Qatar, and in many nations are on the agenda. When we finalized in the United States a rule requiring calorie counts on menus, including for movie theaters, I, CRS, wrote to a friend, this is what happened. It includes movie theaters with great enthusiasm. And my friend emailed me right back, Cass ruined popcorn. I thought that was dispiriting and also deep. The idea is that the experience of eating at a movie theater is diminished on welfare grounds if people think not what a great movie, but how fat I'm not getting. That's not a good thought to have in the movie theater. So some people don't want calorie information and would even pay not to receive it. New data establishes that. And so here is a plea to look for the overall welfare effects of information with emphasis on the probability that some information might reduce welfare. You're looking at a conversation I had with President Obama in which we were actually discussing these kinds of issues, and there is a nut that could not be cracked by the team, which was how to assess the welfare effects of information. And I'm going to describe the importance, the central importance for the next 50 years of cracking the nut, and some little dents that have been made recently. Okay, so with respect to questions like, are you going to get Alzheimer's? Do you have a genetic predisposition to cancer? Whether your spouse or partner cheats on you, the year of your death, etc. There's a lot of division out there in the sense that people tend to be split, generally 50-50, close to that. People really don't want to know the year of their death. And people are willing to pay some material amount to get the information, contingent on their wanting it, but it's not a whole lot. So the intensity of the desire is relatively weak. For regulatorily relevant information, we also see basically a 50-50 division. Do you want to know whether your food contains genetically modified organisms? 60% of a fairly large population said so, and they'd pay $100. 40% don't want to know. Maybe they'd pay something not to get that information. We're not seeing a crescendo of enthusiasm for receiving information. Consistent with what Tali said, sometimes the news is bad, and people don't want bad news. And my plea is that that is a welfare loss that policymakers should take into account, even if it's not decisive. And sometimes people think, who cares? Okay, with respect to the category we're discussing, it's really broad. So think of these as educative nudges. They could include graphic warnings on cigarettes. They could involve greenhouse gas labels. They might involve material that can help you save your life. The scope is very broad. The black hole of regulatory impact analysis, as it's called, is right here. That is valuation of the benefits of receiving information. This is the issue on which much progress remains to be made. All over the world, in sophisticated governments, you can identify 4 approaches to valuation of information. The first is the most popular, which says, we don't know. It's not quantifiable. If we're talking about fuel economy labels, labels that require notification to consumers that conflict minerals were used in a product, even graphic warnings for cigarettes, it is common to say, we just don't know. I think the appropriate answer to that is either, these are technical terms, UGH, UG, or OMG. This is terrible. In cases of this kind, we're imposing significant economic and other costs on the public. And if all that public officials are able to say is, we don't know what the benefits are, that's, let's say that suggests this is a work in progress. The second approach is called break-even analysis, and I want to put kind of 2 check marks next to this as something that's extremely useful, and that those engaged in behaviorally informed interventions or educative nudges should do this kind of as a default method for doing a reality check on whether the intervention's a good idea. The basic idea is to say, what is the lower bound of benefits going to be for this intervention? If the lower bound exceeds the costs, then go for it. Or, what is the upper bound of benefits for this intervention? If the upper bound is higher than if the costs exceed the upper bound, then don't do it. And that will often give us a lot of traction on problems where the social welfare analysis is otherwise extremely challenging. You can see, I hope, that my plea here is in thinking of informational interventions to do something which governments haven't typically done, which is to focus insistently on what are the human consequences of what we're doing, rather than to make a statement or to punish somebody or to reward an interest group or some political priority. Goal is, what are the human consequences? Break-even analysis might be able to tell us, for example, that even if an energy efficiency label for refrigerators produces tiny benefits for the average consumer, that the cost is justified. Or even if it produces more benefits than we can possibly imagine, it's not justified. That will often be good enough for government work. It's the least that can be done, and it's certainly the least that can be demanded. In some governments, there's something more ambitious and worthier. So call this approach number 3, because we're being colorful. It's the end of the day. We have colorful labels. Approach number 3, and this approach is to identify health and economic endpoints. As, for example, by saying calorie labels will save this number of lives or produce this number of health benefits, or graphic warnings for cigarettes will have a specified effect. Notice that this is much more ambitious and impressive than break-even analysis because we're really specifying what will be done for human beings. The problems with break-even, with economic and health endpoints, I think have been signaled by Tali, but let's draw them out. They're intriguing. There is a cognitive cost in going through the information. Some time and effort has to be spent on it. That's not something to be mortified by or alarmed by, but it's not zero. Worse than that is the hedonic cost, the they-ruined popcorn cost. If it's the case that people are confronting information and being made scared or sad, that is an adverse welfare effect which might not overcome the health benefits, let's say, but it's genuinely a welfare effect that government should take on board. If we learn that a certain amount of the population is going to do exactly what it did before, but know something they didn't know before, then they might be sadder smokers or sadder hamburger eaters, and that's a welfare loss independent of the sadness of confronting the information. Also, if people switch, they're sadder non-smokers or sadder salad eaters. Then there is a welfare loss as well by virtue of the fact that their consumption is less enjoyable, and that has to be taken into account. So if people decide that on balance they should have a salad rather than a cheeseburger, on the ground that the latter has many more calories, they will be better off by hypothesis, sadder but wiser and healthier. But they are sadder to the extent that they enjoy their meal less. And that has to be part of the overall welfare analysis, doesn't it? In sophisticated circles in the US government, this is not taken on board, and that's a gap. Okay, I thought for about 4 months that the hero of these remarks would be unlikely, the willingness to pay criterion. And this will show my University of Chicago background, where the idea would be that if we really want to know the effect on people of receiving information, we should ask Tali's question, which is how much are people willing to pay for it? And that would include the health benefit that they anticipate, the hedonic cost that they will face, and everything else. So if you're willing to pay a specified amount for an object of clothing, that will capture the benefit of the clothing for you, it is to be hoped, and so too for information. Let's notice that in the context of information, that's a really hard reality to generate. People, to figure out how much they want to pay to receive information, have to have enough information to know how much it's worth to get information. Kenneth Arrow, the recently deceased amazing economist, was on this in the 1950s, saying that it's very hard to ask people how much they want information unless they have an informational background that will enable them to answer that sensibly. And in that case, they already have the information. Okay, if we could solve that problem, it's also risky because present bias, unrealistic optimism, and lack of attention might drive people to overvalue or undervalue information. People might not want information thinking, as Tali suggested, it'll make me sad, even though it could extend their life a lot. So that's a behaviorally biased, low willingness to pay. So too, optimistic bias might lead to an unduly low or an unduly high willingness to pay, where people say, I'll use that information, but they won't. That would be too optimistic. Or they might think, I'm going to be fine, and I don't need that information. And that's wrong, too. Okay, there's a bigger point here, a larger point for policy in general, which is the willingness to pay criterion, kind of my would-be hero of the piece, is starting to look like a false idol. To make willingness to pay work, people have to solve a prediction problem. That is, when you're buying a computer or a car or tickets to this event or a suit, you have to figure out what are the welfare effects of these things. That's challenging for people. We know enough from behavioral science that with respect to information itself, it's especially challenging to figure out how much will I benefit from information in terms of the welfare effects on my life. Especially deep, I think, problem here is that people's preferences are labile and shifting. That is, with respect to food or consumption generally, what we like is a product both of what information we have and what we're used to. It might be that preferences will switch as people switch from hamburger to salad. They might think salad is great. I really don't need lots of sugar. Or, and this is a technical term invented for this presentation, RNY, which is really not yummy. It's really terrible, in which case the welfare loss will be high, and that is very hard to anticipate in advance. Okay, this is work in progress, and to get out of the black hole is challenging. Endpoints are useful and may produce an upper bound on the benefits. So if we can project health or economic gains, that we're going to have to subtract some stuff from that if you're with me, but that's useful information. It's better than not quantifying, which is the worst thing to do in principle. Willingness to pay is best in principle, but it faces serious empirical challenges, informational gaps, and behavioral biases. The largest point, and this is the right place to do it, is to go back to two heroes, Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, and to suggest that the focus for thinking about information should be on the welfare effects of information. It can be positive, it can be negative. For the next generation, that question, what information actually doing in terms of people's well-being, that's what public officials and the rest of us should attend to. Thanks.
Thank you, Tali and Cass. If I may just open with a question. You mentioned a few different transgressions, Tali, in your slides that perhaps someone might have done something like, I think infidelity was one of them. Do you want to know if your partner has cheated on you? A lot of people justify those things by saying things like, what they won't know won't hurt them about the other person. Through the course of your research, do you think that becomes a more justifiable position to have for the transgressor?
Meaning that it's okay to do something as long as the other person doesn't know.
Right.
Because it has no welfare effect on them. My intuition is yes, that's correct. But that would be true as long as we know for sure that that is A, not going to affect, the other person would not know, and B, it won't affect anything else in our behavior, right? And so you never know whether those two things are right. They're likely not right. And I think but if you're looking at the person who decides whether they want to know or not, well, I mean, once, you have to think about, if I don't know, I might be anxious, right? So this is exactly kind of our point, that you're comparing, if I do know, what is my likely effective reaction? To do that, you have to say, well, what is the likely information? It's kind of what Cass said. You have to make a prediction about what is the information that I will find out, and then, given that, what is my reaction, emotional reaction to that, and then compare that to my current feeling of not knowing. That could be, anxiety. So that's one thing to consider. The other thing is, if I do know and the information suggests something negative, what will I do about that? How will that change my life? And perhaps you don't want to go there, right? I would rather keep the world as it is, but if I do know, I would have to change it. And that is the potential negative instrumental utility of information as well.
Can I give a funny-ish example and then a real-world example? So I asked about 400 people, do you want to know if the person on whom you have a crush has a crush on you? And the answer was basically a 50-50 division, which quite surprised me. I don't know the reason why it wasn't higher than that. Maybe people would be disappointed, and they fear they're disappointed with bad news. The answer is no. Maybe they'd be at risk if the person said yes. problems. Maybe they're married or something, or in a relationship. I asked a large-ish group of Harvard students, graduate students, and every one of them said yes. Younger, maybe more confident, and maybe not at risk. I'll give a policy example which I think bears on the framework Tali illustrated, which is GMO labeling. If you require GMO labels, a certain percentage of the population is going to be scared that there's a health risk. Scientists don't think so. Another part of the population will think that there's a serious environmental risk. That the data is less clear on that, but let's stipulate the view is that's not true either. So work has to be done, I think, to defend the proposition that GMO labels are a good idea, given the significant costs of GMO labels and the question marks next to whether there are real benefits. If that example strikes you as not a good one, it's probably because you think there actually are health or environmental benefits, and that's a detail. The framework is what's more important.
Thank you both. Any questions from the audience? Have we got one here in the front row? Thank you.
Hi, I was wondering what the impact of whether you can do anything about the information. So the cancer screenings is a good one. So many of the cancers are actually caused by lifestyle choices. So you can actually choose to, reduce your chances or, potentially not get cancer at all, as opposed to your date of death, if that's something that's, you can't change. So did you look at the impact of whether people can actually do something about it and whether they would be more likely to want to know the information?
So one of our main factors is what is the likely influence of information on your action? That is, can you do something with that information? So that is exactly the type of thing that you're talking about. So that's one of the 3 factors, and it seems to be very, very important. So in the first slide of results that I showed, you could see that in general, it's actually the most important factor, right? So it has a huge impact on what people's decisions are. And I think the interesting cases are those cases where there's a conflict, where you're telling yourself, well, that information is going to be useful for me, such as medical screenings, and at the same time, it's going to affect my feelings probably negatively. And at that, there's this conflict, and you need to decide what you're going to do. But absolutely, the usefulness of information to your actions is very important.
Another one here in the front row.
How do you get out of the trap of the collective action problem? Take air pollution, right? So you have AQI indices. And if you're in a poor country like India, if you're rich, you can buy air purifiers, but mostly you can't do anything about it unless your government does something. So you would think if you were deciding welfare that I actually shouldn't tell people because, what can they do about it? But then if you don't tell people, then they can't do anything about it because they can't demand that action. So what's the solution in that case?
Okay, so if regulation is solving a collective action problem, then we have a secure argument for it, and nudges can be supplemental to the mandate, let's say, or prohibition, so that's completely right. Information with respect to air quality might, for a number of individuals, be sadness-producing and not allow them to do anything. But population-wide, it could well have beneficial effects for the reason you give. And to specify that over time in terms of the anticipated political demand is challenging, but to ignore it would be a mistake. So we can't do what would be great usually to do, which is to be very quantitative and rigorous. But we might say if the cost of the information disclosure isn't that high, if the incremental sadness, people aren't going to get all depressed, they're just going to think, there's dirtier than I thought, then probably the best bet is to do it.
I think we have time for just one more question. Yes, just over here.
Hello. Right, succinctly. So when I think of the welfare effects of information, I think of Bernie Sanders, and I think about how beyond polarization or political views, you've got people who won't make that decision because it seems too optimistic, it seems too pie in the sky. How can he try and improve the confidence of people that may want to go with that decision but don't want to be, I guess they feel disappointed if they, does that make, sorry, am I making a question there?
I didn't get the original reference.
Sorry, I was
Bernie Sanders.
yeah.
What about Bernie Sanders?
So just looking at his policy, what he wants to try and improve upon in welfare, and essentially how, obviously will be all the naysayers on the complete opposing views, but there will be people that do believe in his views, want to believe in his views, but they seem too optimistic. So going with what you were saying about how if it doesn't seem like it improve their welfare because it just seems too optimistic, then how can you kind of change that thought?
Okay, so there are two things you might say about Senator Sanders that are relevant. One is his policies aren't good on balance, they'd have bad consequences. The other is, and that would be to be engaged on the merits. Another would be they're good policies, but they're not realistic. Then there's just a reasonable debate to be had about realism. Yes, where it could be said, actually, they're more realistic than you think, or no, they're less realistic than you think. And those would be both good merits discussions to have. Here's a very cool bit of data that actually surprises me, that fits very well with this framework. And it maps onto your polarization point precisely. People don't want to receive information and opinions from people whose views are very different from their own. And the reason is they anticipate that it will make them sad and upset. It doesn't. There's a hedonic forecasting error. People's actual hedonic response to seeing points of view and information that opposes their own is much less distressed than they anticipate. And that, for those of us concerned about democracy, is a warning that ex ante people are thinking, keep that away from me, it'll upset me. But it also is like something golden in the sky, which is people, when they see this, they say, oh, that's interesting. Or, it's not right, but now I know something I didn't before.
Okay, that's all we have time for. I just wanted to remind you all that there's a drinks reception immediately after this. And if you want to join us later, there'll be a live recording of the Freakonomics podcast at 6:30. But please join me in thanking Tali and Cass for this very interesting session.